Hello, everyone. Welcome to the AAPI Unity webinar. Today, we're going to be focusing on AAPI Solidarity, Building the American Dream. The organizer and presented by Asian American Unity Coalition, aka AAUC. So today, we'll get to meet Renee Tajima Pena, an Academy Award winner, Academy Award nominated filmmaker and producer of the groundbreaking docuseries Asian Americans on PBS. And we'll also hear unique perspectives from Sanjay Sharma, an Indian American community activist, and Bing Chen, an entertainment industry entrepreneur. We'll also get to see 5 submitted movie reflections selected by our multi-ethnic judging panel, which will feature throughout this webinar. And if you take a look for all the attendees, there is a Q&A box on your screen on the bottom side of it, and where you can submit questions to each presenter. Your questions will be addressed in the Q&A session at the end. And I'll be your MC today. My name is William Lexham. So we'll start this off by a message from the Vice President of the AAUC, Jesse Viscocho, who will also introduce the AAUC.
Thank you, William. It is an honor for me to introduce AAUC today as we continue to build on the momentum that we started sometime in September 2019 when AAUC was created in a historic meeting in Alaska. As many of you know, there are different ethnic groups, including the Chinese, Filipinos, Japanese, and Indian Americans work together to finally establish AAUC. You know, what really contributed to this gathering at that time is the desire, the goal to build that American dream, which we all really wanted to achieve. And by building solidarity, not only with all people, and especially in the API community. As we all know, we are in these trying times of pandemic, and we need to do our part as much as what is possible, you know, given the limitations that we have. And the work that the AAUC has been doing right now is really to continue to be able to reach out to all races and not limited to the to the AAPI community. So again, I would like to echo that the AAPI community through AAUC is in solidarity with building this American dream, that all men are created equal regardless of color, race, or ethnicity. So we're looking forward to an interesting and educational webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Next, we'll have a message from the president of the AAUC, SK Low, and the vice president of the AAUC, Dr. Piyush Agarwal.
Hi, my name is SK Low. I'm a Chinese American from Hong Kong. I came to this country as a teenager to study physics and mathematics, and I got my PhD in theoretical physics. After that, I spent 1 year in Japan as a postdoc. And coming back to the US, I worked for Honeywell in the defense research area, and where I also got my master's degree in strategic management. Since then, I started 2 centers in Kumon and have over 1,000 students. That's where I learned also my people skill to deal with people on a day-to-day basis. I'm very honored to be elected as the first president of AAUC, and I believe this organization is really needed to unite all the voices from Asian Americans and Pacific Islander, so we can have a seat at the table and be able to make some changes in the inequality in the system. And I want all of you to join forces with me. Thank you.
Greetings. This is Piyush Agarwal, Vice President of AAUC. I'm a former United Nations expert, and I retired as superintendent of schools. After that, I did the business, was very successful. I've been working to unite the Asian community for the last 40 years, and that mission still continues. Still, I'm working with AUC to make sure that we Asians stay united. Efforts will continue. Let's hope for the positive results. Thank you very much. Greetings to all of you. Bye.
Thank you so much, SK, and thank you so much, Dr. Piyush Agarwal. And next, we're going to have Dr. Xiaoyan Zhang, the chair of the AAUC Public Relations Committee, who's going to make a statement calling for the end of entrenched racism and violence.
Thank you, William, for the introduction. The killing of George Floyd calls for the end of entrenched racism and violence. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Black lives matter. Asian Americans need to stand in solidarity with African Americans to fight for greater equality in the US. Violence begets violence and does not solve any problem. We condemn them all. No one should be left behind. We must build our collective American dream together. Let's remember Dr. King's words. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Xiaoyan Zhang. And now we're going to just really acknowledge our judges who were able to review all the submitted reflections. They recommended 12 finalists and rated and selected the top 5 for sharing in this webinar today. So the judges today are Jing Liu, community volunteer and activist and media editor; Stephen Lee, NYPD sergeant and officer, and also running for New York District Assembly in District 40, Flushing, New York; Angela Anand, trained journalist with published work; Bobby Lee, Vietnamese American community president for Virginia, Maryland, and DC; Jenny Kim, national president of the Korean American Coalition; Munsup So, vice president, membership, executive committee, 80/20 PAC; Jesse Viscocho, president of the Asian American Pacific Islander Coalition of Alaska; Tony Nakazawa, professor emeritus and member of Alaska chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League; and Chang-Fu Chang, professor and filmmaker. So now we're going to hear 2 reflections of the Asian American series on PBS by Karen Jobu and Linda Kim.
As I look back on my life and I watch this PBS program, Asian Americans, this has helped me see the connections that we all have. In 1942, my family was interned in Gila Bend, Arizona, as part of the evacuation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. I think it was in my 40s that I understood that this internment had affected me even though I was only 2 years old. My family never talked about the internment, and when I took a speech class, I was going to do the speech on 3 memories I had from this time. As I practiced, I found that I became so depressed and started to cry uncontrollably. Later in my life, I was asked to be interviewed for a student documentary at a month of remembrance. I then started to interview my family and piece together our family history. Today, I see that this discrimination is happening again with the Latino children placed in camps. And instead of the yellow peril, we have the Chinese virus. The other thing that I remember seeing in a pre-internment photograph was a sign in another Asian-owned store window saying that they were not Japanese. However, the bigger community does not see us as Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, and so forth. They only see a yellow face. Vincent Chen was murdered with a baseball bat because weeks earlier, some auto workers bashed in a Honda car and it was shown nationwide on TV. Just as the bigger community does not see us differently, we too must support each other so that as a bigger group, a bully would think twice about discriminating against us. We need also to support our African American and Latino American brothers and sisters, because they too have this history of discrimination. Hopefully, then we can make a better world together.
Spring 1970. I was 9. My father, an engineering graduate of prestigious Seoul University, was in management. We enjoyed a comfortable life, private school, housekeepers, and nannies. Racks of rifles installed at work and gun turrets being built in town were the last straw for Dad. The fragile ceasefire with North Korea was an ever-present reality. We were moving to the U.S., no discussion, period. The horror of surviving wars and recovering his father's body from the assassination of local officials affected much of Dad's personality. It took forgiveness and maturation for me to appreciate his huge sacrifice. The move worked out great for everyone, but him. The descent from respected manager to belittled storekeeper made his life pure drudgery. Fear of being a disappointment, we 3 siblings made sure we were successful. Thrown into school where all I understood was the clock and math. It's a credit to the Los Angeles school system's English as a second language program and Bugs Bunny that I was able to graduate from UC Berkeley's undergraduate business school and become a successful managing director and head of global operations for Barclays Global Investors and later BlackRock. Excellence, results, and leadership mattered. I was oblivious about being an outspoken, atypical Asian and one of few, if not the only woman in the room, unless it was pointed out. My parents joked that I probably would have been arrested during the pro-democracy movement had we not emigrated. Yet another reason to be grateful for my dad's fateful decision.
All right, thank you so much, Linda and Karen, for your reflections. And now we're going to be able to hear from our first panelist today, Sanjay Sharma. He is the chairman of HVIA, which includes over 250 families in North Baltimore County. HVIA supports community by providing cultural events, educational programs, and entertainment. Sanjay immigrated to Salt Lake City, Utah as a student and lived there for over 15 years. Sanjay is a senior consultant to several large pharmaceutical companies in the US and abroad, and now is part of Siemens providing digital solutions to medical and consumer health companies.
And Ms. Mimi for giving me this opportunity to be here. And I'm also pleased that we have our Academy Award nominee, Ms. Renee, with us today. And I'm eagerly looking forward to her speech. I love the docu-series that she made, and I just want to listen to her on why she made it, how she made it. So I'm thanking her for opening our eyes by educating us about these unsung Asian American heroes that people didn't know about. So let me just get into a quick intro. As William mentioned, I live in Maryland now. And the nice thing about Maryland is the first lady, Ms. Yumi Hogan, is Korean American. So it's wonderful to see how Governor Logan appreciates and supports diversity through his Office of Community Initiatives. About 5 years back, some of us got together and we started as a association called the Hunt Valley Indian Association. The goal was to provide cultural, educational, and community service opportunities. It's completely volunteer-based organization. Okay, we have several guests of all colors that have enjoyed our events, and you can look at the pictures here. I mean, we do a Diwali function, a fashion show. We were also involved in this with the Indian Americans for Hillary Clinton. 2 weeks back, we did a food drive for people who lost their jobs due to COVID. We also support some religious groups and all that because we believe in equality and respect for all religions. And I think one of the guy who's in this picture is probably in the audience. So I'm just going to give a shout out to him. Hi, Devang. I'm glad you're here. Okay. So coming to the main topic, right? The reason why we are here. This is what is American Dream. So when you saw the series, we had Connie Young. She mentioned that this started in 1860s when these Chinese immigrants came as part of the gold rush. Of course, they were late. I mean, Asians are notorious for coming late to all parties, right? So they ended up working in the railroads. But the thing is, they all came with a dream, the dream of improving their lives. And I think the dream, we all have our own dreams, and we have different dreams, right? Financial, some of us are here for safety, freedom, and some of us want status. We want like bigger car, a bigger house, and nice clothes and whatnot. But I think American dream is much more than that. It's something, I call it to be in a country where there's no bias, to be in a country where there's no discrimination. And that's why I said, look, colored lives matter, Black lives matter, and Asian American unity is important. I mean, we all saw what happened, right? About 13 days back, this inhumane, cowardly display of white power by 4 officers. This has to stop. And it's up to us to make it stop. So why is this American dream important, right? Well, you looked at the series, you look at the docu-series, you see what happened. This is history, okay? Historically, Asian Americans in this country have been discriminated. 1870s, there was the anti-Chinese movement. And what was the reason? Because they thought they were a threat to the American labor, which they were not. They were out here to help. They were demonized, they were called Satans, they were burned, they were hanged, and they were killed. And the same thing happened in 1942. Japan attacks. Well, okay, that's fine. The 2 countries were at war. But what happened after that? American citizens, 110,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated. And remember, 2/3 of those were US born. Think about that. 2/3 US born citizens were incarcerated because a foreign country attacked America. This has to stop. Same thing happened in 2001. Okay, there was a terrorist attack. Granted, that was bad. It shouldn't have happened. But who suffered because of that? It was the Muslims, it was the Sikhs. There's Islamophobia. People were killed over a terrorist attack. Citizens of America were killed because of that. And now you see that in 2020, the COVID, it's supposedly Chinese. I mean, who calls it a Chinese disease or a Chinese virus? It's not Chinese virus. It's a disease that started, right? Okay, I agree, it originated in China. That doesn't make it Chinese virus. So when our Asian American reporters try to ask the leader about some questions which they're doing the job, they don't get fair treatment. This has to stop, because racial discrimination is not what we are here for. So now the question is, how do you realize your American dream, right? And this, I think, is a pretty challenging part, because our American dream is constantly evolving. Okay? There is no one answer to say, how would somebody just realize their own American dream? I had some of the thoughts. I mean, these are some of the things that I have seen that have worked, and I just wanted to share those with you. So the number one, I feel, is Asian American unity. We have to be united. Look, if we are united, we rule, we win, we have the power. And if we don't unite, somebody else has the power, and they decide what happens to you. So this is my call to you guys, unite. Okay. Second is community service. And you may say, why is community service important? Look, a lot of non-Asian American immigrants, that's what I call them actually, they don't know about us. They just see the skin, they see the color of skin. We need to show them who we are. We need to connect with them. We need to show them that we care. It's from inside, we are all the same. And that's what we want to show them. Okay, then that's, I think, done by community service. I'm not saying community service only within your community. I'm saying community service for everyone. The next thing is communicate, right? I mean, well, Asian Americans have issues communicating. I mean, we have our own accents and whatnot, right? My daughter still make fun of me. Every week I get like, Daddy, that's not the way you're supposed to say it, right? That's fine. But still, go out and communicate. Okay? And now we have social media, right? Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and I don't know what else kids use these days. So there's something called TikTok or whatever, right? Use these tools to communicate and show what you're doing, so people around you get to know you and they realize what you are. And the last one, which is most important, I think, is to be the decision maker. And when I say decision maker, I mean you be the person in charge. You go and capture White House, you rule the White House, or go and capture the state, become a senator, become something, become someone, either at state level, at a county level, school level, or PTA level, any level. Go out and become one. Now, I know not everyone can become that, right? But look around you. You will find people who are capable of doing that. Go out and support these guys and let them become the community leaders. Just wanted to briefly talk about the American dream from now and moving forward, right? This election year is very important. This is the first time we have the most South Asian candidates that are running for election. Okay, there are 28 plus that are running for Congress, running for state, they're running for local races. And this is just the South Asian candidates. I mean, think of adding the Asian Americans to it, and this list would explode. Look around, find who are these guys, find out about them. And if if your values align with their values, go out and vote. So in conclusion, I wanted to quote before I conclude, let me just summarize everything, right? So you know that what your American dream is, figure out what your American dream is and see how it is maturing. Okay? And you probably agree now that history has taught us a lesson that why we need to have that American dream and why we need to unite. And lastly, I hope you've also figured out that unless we unite together, somebody else will rule us. So if there is one thing I want to convey to you guys, if one message that you're going to take home tonight is that go out and vote in this election. That's the only way we can all be together. That's the only way we can actually gather some power. And again, I listen to Mahatma Gandhi, or I listen to his quotes, and look, you must be the change that you want to see in the world. If you don't, you can't change the world. And future depends on what you do today. Not doing anything is not an option. You have to do something. And lastly, I wanted to conclude this with a song. And this is a song, We Shall Overcome. This was a protest song and a key anthem during the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King, he used his words in his final sermon. And then a renowned Indian poet, Girja Kumar Mathur, he composed this translation in Hindi. So I'm going to read in Hindi, but the meaning is out there. You can read what it is. And if you know the song, or if any of my high school classmates are here because they have heard this song over time in school, I would request them to sing along or hum along. So here I go. हम होंगे कामयाब, हम होंगे कामयाब, हम होंगे कामयाब एक दिन. ओहो मन में है विश्वास, पूरा है विश्वास, हम होंगे कामयाब एक दिन. हम चलेंगे साथ साथ, हम चलेंगे साथ साथ, हम चलेंगे साथ साथ एक दिन. ओहो मन में है विश्वास, पूरा है विश्वास, हम होंगे कामयाब एक दिन. All right, guys, thank you and enjoy the rest of the webinar. God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Sanjay. Thank you, and thank you for singing to us as well. Thank you so much. And now we're gonna have the next two selected reflections by Mary Lou, who is a product strategist from Pittsburgh, and Brian Zhao, who's 10 years old and lives in New Jersey.
During the past 200 years, Asian Americans had to fight to gain basic human rights in this country. Fast forward to today, we face existential crises threatening not only Asian Americans, but all Americans. These problems are bound to dramatically change our lives over the next 50 years. Think about large-scale machine deployments that degrade humans into Amazon Turks. Think about the sharp rise of income inequality. Think about the deterioration of the natural environment. How can more Asian Americans grow quickly into local and national leaders for all Americans? What is the best way to pool our resources and maximize impact? I hope our community strategists will think big, create a clear vision of the future, and lead the country. This is our moment to shine.
Don't forget your roots. How the documentary Asian Americans changed me. My great-grandpa always told me, don't forget your roots. I didn't understand what he meant until I watched the PBS news show Asian Americans. Chinese immigrants risked their lives to build the Transcontinental Railroad, but at the Golden Spike ceremony there was not a single Chinese face in the crowd. This is so unfair. Meanwhile, proudness swelled in my chest. My ancestors worked so hard to make a living in America. Now I realize what my great-grandpa was talking about. I am proud to be Chinese American. As much as our ancestors had contributed, they were left out of the history curriculum in America. There was no mention of the Filipinos' heavy involvement in the movement for better pay, or the Japanese American infantry that freed captured U.S. soldiers. I thought we needed a balanced curriculum. Later, I learned that a new curriculum based off of the film was being developed for grades 7 to 12. I felt grateful that our ancestors' stories would be told. When Asians immigrated to the U.S., they were wronged, tortured, and called devils. Now, while the coronavirus is tearing apart the world, Asian Americans are facing similar prejudice and are being attacked and villainized. History is cycling back. We cannot let history repeat itself.
Wow, incredible. Yeah, I think we need Brian on the panel. He could teach us quite a lot about what we can do moving forward. And absolutely, because he's definitely the future. I'd like to actually introduce our next panelist and our next guest, Bing Chen. He co-founded and is the chairman of Gold House, the largest collective of pioneering Asian founders, creative voices, and leaders dedicated to building global cross-cultural success. A serial digital media entrepreneur and investor, he previously was YouTube's global head of creator development and management. He is also a board director of the Coalition of Asian Pacifics in Entertainment and Asia Society, Southern California. He and his companies have been recognized by the Forbes 30 Under 30 list, the Hollywood Reporter's 35 Under 35, and Magic Johnson 32 Under 32, among others. Thank you so much for joining us, Bing.
Thanks for having me, William. And it's such a privilege to be here with everyone. I agree with William. The future is very bright. Thank you to Brian for doing his homework and speaking so eloquently. Was really inspiring to see. I've been asked to talk a little bit about why our community continues to be divided. I think the greatest challenge is, even though the notion of the language of Asian American was erected about 51 to 52 years ago by students in the Bay Area, the reality is our identity is a constant one of becoming. It is a constant work in progress. This has been furthered by the fact that we are not only the fastest growing immigrant population, as so many of us know, but also because of our geographic transience, increasingly because of economic mobility and opportunities. And the younger generation finds itself to be a member of multiple nations as opposed to just one, like many of us historically. The other confounding factor here is that mixed race births in this country are now outpacing non-mixed race births. And that growth is almost entirely coming from Asia and South America because of immigration rates. Moreover, I think we all know some other sort of challenges our communities face. One is some of us are citizens, others are undocumented. And also we face this notion of the model minority myth that I think enough of us now know is highly problematic for largely two reasons. The challenge, of course, is I think some of us are still very proud of this myth. We, after all, have the highest average income per household. We are the most educated population at the aggregate, so forth and so on. But what this ignores is two or three factors. One, it ignores that we also have the widest income disparity of any community in this country. We actually have the bottom 10% of socioeconomic status. When you go to certain regions, especially, this pronounces itself. So for instance, 50% of Asian students in New York City actually grew up in poverty, which of course is different from the notion of the model minority myth. Finally, is the model minority myth also sort of obfuscates our ability to ascend the highest echelons of society. This is most notably pronounced in technology and finance, where we represent a disproportionately high percentage of the employee base relative to our 5.6, 5.8 percentage demographic representation domestically. When you look at tech, for instance, we're about a third of the employee base, but we're half of executive ranks and single digits in the C-suite. I know a lot of us sort of forget that because we have so many incredible, mostly South Asian executives and C-suiters, whether it's Satya over at Microsoft or Sundar over at Alphabet. But again, The reality is, by the numbers, we are still low. And finally, if you look at other factors like gender, Harvard Business Review, everyone's former favorite university, actually articulated that women and Asian women are the least likely to get promoted in corporate management. Now, I don't know why anyone would post a study like this, but the fact remains that we have to support not only our race, but we also have to support women, period, and particularly from the systemic bias that they have felt in corporations in that case. Now, why has this actually come to be? Why are we still so divided? Well, the short answer is we don't have a biological or sort of genetic tie. We have 50 different ethnicities. We have hundreds of dialects. We have no central historic struggle. We also have no central single political issue. For most of us, we're actually split down the middle on most causes. We have no regular convening ground. So we don't have church that we all go to or temple that we all go to every week. And finally, we're also distributed across the world. My favorite fun fact is that the largest diaspora of Japanese folks outside of Japan is actually, of course, in Brazil. And so our fracturing across the sort of globe, whether it's genetically or geographically and so forth, has prevented this convening. Moreover, you also see persistent implicit bias within the Asian community. So there's still an inexplicable rift between East and South Asians. Moreover, the Filipino community, which is the second largest Asian ethnicity in this country and the first documented Asians to be in this country in the 1580s, they're known as the Luzonians, are also often omitted from these conversations. So then the question becomes, well, what can unite us? Where can we actually begin? And I think there are two places. One is, I want to echo what Sanjay said earlier. We have an imperative to vote, and more importantly, one could argue, we have an imperative to fill out the census. The census controls, a gazillions amount of dollars. I believe the average impact per citizen is roughly about $25,000 to $30,000 each, but that will necessarily impact all the ways that we are able to live in society. And Asians are not only the least likely to vote, we are also the least likely to fill out the census. So that's something practical that I agree with Sanjay, we have to sort of begin doing. I think the second piece that we have to think about is, even if we don't care about our race or others, the reality is that the world runs on one race, and that race is green, and it is known as money. And this sounds tacky and like a very Asian thing to say, but it's not wrong. It is the pragmatic approach. I've been particularly, I don't even know the right adjective. I've been particularly upset, I suppose, most recently and sad at how many of our small, medium-sized businesses are literally dying right now. It was already because of COVID, and now it's become even worse because of looters. And there's been all sorts of data, one, for instance, from the Center for Responsible Lending, that indicated that 75+% of Asian-owned businesses and 91+% of Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander-owned businesses have, quote, no chance of receiving a PPP loan from a mainstream bank or credit union because of a lack of a previous relationship. And this, again, is part of sort of societal structural bias. That necessarily means these businesses are going to go under, and that's not something that I want to see. I think all of us, find the essential value of Asian-owned businesses, particularly the 3 million that we founded over the past few years. And so something simple that all of us can do is, whether you're buying food, whether you're buying garments, whatever have you, especially in this period, to go out of your way to find not only Asian, but minority-owned businesses that we can support. And then finally, is, as everyone has said today, and I think was one of the impetuses of this great forum, is the plight of other communities in so many ways is much graver than ours. Having acid thrown in your face is terrible, especially as an elder and innocent, and as someone who's innocent. But being suffocated on the street by a police officer and dying is admittedly and decidedly worse. And so we have a responsibility as a fellow minority and as fellow human beings to speak up, not only for the Black community, but for the Latinx community, for the Islamic community, for the LGBTQ community, and so forth. Because a single hit against any minority, we must not forget, is necessarily a permissive hit against all of us. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much, and I could not agree more. It's very interesting because all of the marginalized communities combined are the majority. So we need to support each other and take power back and really fight for equality and real equity. So now we're going to have our last and final reflection by Joy Guo, a serial entrepreneur and community activist.
This documentary highlighted Asian American experiences of how they have suffered from systemic discrimination, spanning different historical periods and the contributions older generations made to the civil rights movement. It is educational and enlightening for us to consider at the modern day today, especially under the landscape of deepening global pandemic and deteriorating U.S.-China relations, how we should view racism and discrimination and formulate our strategy to fight back. I believe with the world becoming more flat, American becoming more diversified, Asian Americans becoming more engaged in civic lives and politics, discrimination towards Asians has taken on different forms. In the past, facing systemic discrimination, we fought from top down. Now we need to do the opposite. As an independent, I cannot help notice talks about racism and discrimination often stem from partisan attacks, while in reality, they often happen at the grassroots level because of lack of knowledge of Asian American history and culture. Therefore, I feel our efforts should start from education to the general public. For example, we can advocate to have Asian American history written into K-12 curriculums. We can create interactive maps to record our history. We can also pick to fight a couple of high-profile legal battles to make people aware that one cannot call Asians to go back to their country, just like one cannot call African Americans Negroes. Having said that, overly sensitive about the racial issues and using this as partisan attacks are not effective strategies in modern day America.
Thank you so much, Joy. And yes, right now we're going to have Dr. Zhang, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, the director of Asian Americans docuseries on PBS, Renee Tajima Pena. And before they do that, I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions, hit the Q&A box on the bottom over here and ask your questions directed to any of our panelists, and we'll have an opportunity for them to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, William. It is my privilege really to get to know this director, Renee, and she is, when I reach out to her, she's very, very grateful to accept the invitation, but also she is very support our whole move, the whole event for this, and because she realized the importance of the history and this movie will be for the community, and we're very grateful to have her today here. And of course, she is a award-nominated director, and she has done many other movies as well. Some of those you know, like Who Killed Vincent Chen, you know, the My America, you know, and there's many. So she has done so much for the Asian American community. We're so honored to have her here today, and I just want everybody to hear what she's going to comment, and we are together here try to build a collective American dream. Without further ado, and Renee, it's yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I mean, I wish the team, I'm the series producer. The episode producers were Leo Cheng, Grace Lee, and Geeta Gandaber, and they would be really moved by, because this is exactly what we wanted. We wanted the series to raise discussion and also reflection of where we've been, where we're going. And to echo Brian, actually in the very first staff meeting, we remembered our ancestors, both the storytellers, the filmmakers who came before us, and also our ancestors, not only family, but the people in the unsung Asian American heroes who have really fought the good fight over, you know, this past, actually centuries that we've been here. Of course, when we started this series, this was before the pandemic season we're in now, this pandemic of disease and hate. But the central kinds of fault lines were already there, and they've been there throughout our history here in the US. But particularly in recent years, the US has become much more diverse, but at the same time more divided. So we wanted to answer the question, or at least propose the question, how do we move forward together as Americans? And we really believe that the Asian American story helps to illuminate that way forward. I mean, today people have talked about actually two sides of the American dream. And one is, you know, we come here for a better life, for economic opportunity. But the other side of the American dream is this pursuit of equality. And, you know, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And Asian Americans have always been on that trajectory. But that part of the Asian American story really is not known. And story really matters, particularly when we're talking about, you know, moving forward in solidarity. The African American novelist Toni Morrison said, you know, there's a master narrative that's been written, but we haven't written it. It's been written by somebody else. And so what we want to do with the series is help to rewrite our own narrative and our own story as Asian Americans. Part of the narrative that's been imposed on us has been the narrative of the model minority and the perpetual foreigner. We saw that, you know, with early immigration in the 1800s, where we started the series. We see it today. Another part of that narrative that's been imposed upon us is conflict with other people of color. There is tension and conflict, there always has been, but there has always been solidarity, and that story is not known. So, you know, we started the series not at the very beginning of when the first Asian Americans came here, but we started with the first major wave of immigration, which is, you know, around mid 1800s and after the Civil War, a time when the US was rebuilding and looking for labor. And even then, the narrative of a racial hierarchy and racial difference that operates today was being constructed. In 1878, a politician said, one white man is worth two Chinamen, but one Chinaman is worth two Negroes. So you can see even the seeds of not only this idea that we're different, we're the other, we're the perpetual foreigner, but you can also see the seeds of the model minority and the wedge and the way the model minority has been used as a wedge against other people of color. So there's no coincidence. We thought that anti-Asian exclusion and Jim Crow laws were happening at the same time in that early period. But there was also solidarity. I mean, a few years after that politician stated, you know, the white men, Chinamen, Negro, his racist motto, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted, but Frederick Douglass, the Black abolitionist leader, denounced the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. He denounced it as being a racist measure. In the early 1900s, South Asian immigrants and other Asian immigrants were supporters of the Marcus Garvey movement. And in fact, the editor of Marcus Garvey's newspaper, Negro World, was an Indian immigrant. So from the very beginning, Asian Americans have been on that trajectory of fighting for justice and equality. And not only for Asian Americans, but for all Americans. You know, in the early period, you can go back to Wong Kim Ark, who was a US born, he was citizen, Chinese American. In the late 1800s, he was a restaurant worker in San Francisco. And he was denied re-entry to his home of the United States because he was Chinese. And he didn't take it sitting down. Wong Kim Ark took his case all the way to the US Supreme Court. And, you know, if you're like me, if I had to go to traffic court, I'm like jittery. But can you imagine at a time when Chinese Americans were near the bottom of the social rung, were completely politically powerless in this country. And he had the balls to take his case to the US Supreme Court, and he won. He won. He won the precedent for citizenship birthright, so that anybody born here, regardless of who their parents are, if their parents are immigrants, if they're undocumented immigrants, they can be they're US citizens. That's how my parents became US citizens, because my grandparents, who immigrated from Japan in the early 1900s, were considered for over 50 years, about 50 years that they were here, they were considered aliens, ineligible for citizenship. But their children were born in Los Angeles and Salt Lake City and different places in the US, and they were all US citizens. So you know, all of us, and we were a mostly Asian American team, we all did look to our family stories when we were creating the series. You know, as I mentioned, my grandparents came in the early 1900s. My mother's father came in April of 1906. And as soon as he stepped offshore in San Francisco, he was chased down by merchant marines who, you know, threw rocks at him and told him to go back to China. He was from Japan, but they told him to go back to China. So he just took the first bus or wagon train or whatever down to Los Angeles. I mean, as it turns out, the next day was the San Francisco earthquake in 1906, so he missed the earthquake, so maybe they saved his life. But, you know, from his first step onto American shores, he was harassed because of his race. He was assaulted because of his race. But his children, of course, were born as US citizens. However, they were born as second-class citizens, as Nisei, as Japanese Americans. The family lived through the Great Depression. In World War II, they were either imprisoned in concentration camps, or in the case of my father and my uncles, they were in the US Army. But in the 1950s, they were able to rebuild, and in large part because of the civil rights movement and the Black movement for equality. I mean, my family, and I realized this, it kind of dawned on me much later in life, that one of my first homes outside of Chicago, in a suburb of Chicago, there were only 3 Asian American families in the entire town. And we all lived on the same block. And until I was an adult, it didn't dawn on me that we lived on the same block because of redlining. But we were actually able to desegregate the town because there had been restrictive covenants where people of color, Asians, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans were just not allowed in many cities and towns and neighborhoods around the United States. Asian Americans at one time in many states could not intermarry with a white person because of anti-miscegenation laws. We went to desegregated schools. We couldn't get the jobs we wanted. But those doors were open to us by the civil rights movement. But at the same time in the 1950s is a time when this idea of the model minority who, you know, just pulls themselves up by their bootstraps and works hard and, you know, is very quiet and turns the other cheek, that began to be used as a wedge against the Black civil rights movement. But for my generation, the third generation, and I came of age during the 1970s in the birth of the Asian American movement, we learned for the first time about the civil rights movement. We learned for the first time about our parents and our grandparents' history and their sacrifice. And we were able to stand up and we were able to create new points of solidarity with other people of color, with other Americans who wanted equality, no matter their background or race. So today, you know, we're writing the first draft of this history, and this is a historic moment. And this pandemic of hate and the idea of the Chinese virus, the Kung flu, That's not a new story. But the solidarity that we're seeing across Asian American communities and the solidarity with other communities of color is also not a new story. It's not a new story. And that's something that with the series we wanted to amplify. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this conversation because that's exactly what your community, your organization is really doing, and with people of all generations, Asian Americans of all different nationalities. So just to close, Asian Americans today are fighting back and standing up. It's full circle from the years of Frederick Douglass and the years of the early Asian American immigrants. And that's an old story that I really like. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for organizing this and inviting me.
Thank you so much, Renee, and really thank you so much for all the work that you did in putting this series out. It was an eye opener, and it really informed me quite a lot about our history in America that is simply just not taught in the history books. So thank you so much. So yes, thank you everyone for participating, and now we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. And this is for all of the panelists. And I'm going to combine these two questions, one from Rem Tawari and Huizong Guo. Well, actually, before that, Marsha Galanco. There are differences within the Asian American communities, socially, economically, and politically. How do you unite all Asian Americans, including API, and how do you connect Asian Americans as a group to stand as in unity and solidarity with other non-Asian groups?
So who's answering that? The panelists?
Anyone's welcome to answer.
It's the $1 million question again. I'm sorry.
I can start.
It's a very hard question. There is no simple way. There is no easy way to unite Asian Americans. And well, there's no simple way to unite Indians. Forget about Asian Americans. Okay. I mean, you put 4 Indians in a room, they'll form 3 different parties. Okay. And the 4th one will be like, here, I'm not going to vote for any of you. So it's not an easy thing. I wish I had an answer for you, but I think showing them the true meaning, the goal, focusing on the goal, right? What is our goal? Our goal is to have an Asian American president or an Asian American government or an Asian American leader. Focus on that goal and see how you can achieve it. Once you show the goal put the goal in front of people, they'll figure out a way to unite themselves. There are differences, but we can set them apart and focus on the goal. Thing or others you can...
I think there's a couple ways to do this. One is the healthy way to do this is to address and fully understand the intrinsic bias that we have at socioeconomic levels, certainly ethnic lines, and certainly gender lines. But I candidly don't think we can wait for that conversation to be done, because that conversation will not happen at a universal level. To the point where we all agree on a singular canon, vernacular, and so forth. So I think in parallel to that, I think there are 2 things. One of my friends actually, who's part of the Black Lives Matter movement this week, interestingly said that maybe the policy issue that will actually unite our community is actually a policy issue that befalls another community. And to that note, I've been really inspired by all the Asians who've been really speaking up for the Black community amongst all the police brutalities that have always happened, but have been especially more visible this week. And so I think that's one. I think someone else's policy may actually help us unite. The second issue is the economy. So I know I sound, again, very sort of callous and so forth, but we are kidding ourselves if we think that money is not significant, if not principal, in sustaining any form of systemic change. I reference 2 different countries that have sort of, really popped up into prominence over the past 2 decades with this. First is Singapore, and second is the UAE. Both countries, as I think many of us know, are less than about 60 years old. So they're almost too young. They have too few yesterdays to actually be defined by any sort of structural universal nationalist culture. And so instead, both of them have very wisely defined their identities based on what they build tomorrow. And that is, of course, the economy. Fast forward from the past few, let's call it 10 to 15 years, Singapore has displanted every other region in Asia as the new multinational hub for Asia. Every major multinational has moved its headquarters from Hong Kong and Tokyo over to Singapore. This obviously is because of a very smart set of investments, tax incentives, and all that. But they have become a uniting power for the entire continent. The UAE similarly has done something very similar in the Middle East, where, did any of you know about Dubai 2 decades ago? The answer is probably not, right? But again, because of a set of wise economic policies, they have now become the essential hub in the Middle East, in the UAE. And so I think there's something instructive there for us. And so, if we can't unite on single policies or races, perhaps we can unite on success. And I don't just mean the success of, getting more women on boards in the C-suite or getting more Filipinos engaged in these conversations. I mean at every level, ensuring that we can continue to invest in our small and medium-sized businesses to ensure there's a system around them. One sort of very encouraging note here is about 30% of the companies that have been founded in the last decade that are worth over $500 million in this country are actually founded by at least one Asian American. So we actually have a gift in creating economic power. And I think that's probably where we begin. I'm of course not trying to negate all the gravity of real other policy issues, but again, I think in the absence of something that's unifying, I think that could be one of them.
In addition to, I'll kind of round it out. You've talked about the political approaches, economic approaches, and I'll talk a little bit about the grassroots approaches. I started with saying stories matter, but as a filmmaker, I don't believe for a minute that films create social justice. I think that people do. People are organized and they do it. And that the organization, your coalition, Asian Americans actually have always been very organized. I mean, in the 1860s, the single largest labor strike in the United States was organized by Chinese immigrant railroad workers. So we've always been very organized. This current moment really, it reminds me in a way of the Vincent Chin case, in that in Detroit, a lot of Asian Americans actually, did not see themselves as being political subjects. They saw themselves, many of them, as so-called model minorities. They had, jobs, sometimes professional jobs, and they thought that they had made it. And either they had not experienced racism, or they just kind of blocked it out if they had. And when Vincent Chin was murdered, and his murderers didn't serve a single day in jail, they were really awakened. They remembered, what had happened in their own lives. And then they realized, what was happening at the time when Asian Americans in the 1980s were disproportionately targets of hate crimes around the country. But that kind of awakening happened because people were organized. Helen Zia, who's the head of the Campaign for Justice, had come out of the Asian American movement as a student activist. Stuart Quo and the lawyers, the civil rights lawyers from the Asian American community who descended on Detroit and worked with the local lawyers like Jim Shimura and Eliza Chan, they came out of Asian American activism, and they were already involved in the organized Asian American movement. And I think that's what's happening today, that Asian Americans are, after Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, on top of, this drumbeat of violence towards Black and brown people, Asian Americans, like other Americans, are shocked. But there has been a really important framing of, the relationship between the anti-Asian kind of pandemic hate and the roots of racism, and this kind of how the model minority has been deployed to counter the calls for justice of other communities of color. And that comes from organization. It comes from being organized during good times and being organized, in times of crises. So I think all these kinds of entry points of standing for justice justice meaning not just us, but justice for all. I think all these entry points are really critical.
Thank you guys so much, and all of your answers actually answered the next two questions, which was not like, you know, what's Asian Americans' role in the Black Lives Matter movement, and you know, and how do we kind of solve the root problem of the divide that is in the Asian American community, which is what Hui Zhongguo believes that is an economic issue of upper mobility issue than just a racial issue. So thank you for that. And I'd like to probably I think we have time just for just this one last question from Thomas. The larger society or the white population describes Asian Americans as the model minority because of our success in achieving the American dream much faster than other communities. In a way, it is preferential treatment to Asian Americans by the white community over African and Latino communities. So how do we set priorities in achieving the American dreams faster and or help African and Latino communities do the same?
I'll give a small note. I think the first step is remembering that the model minority myth is a myth. And if one of us in one ethnicity, one gender, one socioeconomic bracket has not made it, then we have all failed. So it begins with on our own. We have to make sure that all of us can actually systematically rise. And there is a way to do that, by the way, whether it's small things as a consumer and buying from local restaurants or local businesses, whether it's as big businesses, going out of your way to hire for diversity because Asian is not just a monolithic box that you check, so forth and so on. The second piece, I think, is we have to find where we're concentric with other communities. I think we all agree that our experience of racism and systemic bias is very, very different, and one could argue less grave than those of the Black and brown communities. That being said, I do think the solutions that we'll find are going to be highly concentric. So I'll give you a soft one within film. I think director and producer Renee is being too modest. I think film is always a progenitor, or often a progenitor in media of societal change. Let us not forget that we saw a Black man in the Oval Office on film and TV long before we did in the actual Oval Office. Even if that movie was Fifth Element, even if that show was 24. But when you paint what is possible, because so many of us don't have great imaginations, you demonstrate what can be possible to many people, including people like Barack Hussein Obama and so forth. And so let's look to film. In film, the Latinx, Asian, and Black communities control 50% of the box office. That is half of the box office. So if we can suddenly support each other's films, suddenly, because film is still the high art, and I'm not just saying this because Renee's here, but film is still the high art in visual media, such that TV, publishing, and so forth follow it. So suddenly, if you can show that minorities are collaborating, that our stories are essential in the highest vehicle in theatrical, suddenly you're going to see that perpetuate across all media. Suddenly, if you see that opportunity perpetuate across all media, what if that opportunity could also perpetuate in the boardroom? What if that could also vernacular perpetuate into policy, so forth and so on? So again, I realize film sometimes is sort of thrown away as, you know, something frivolous, but the reality is, one, it takes all kinds. Two, is film is indelible in showing what's possible. And three, I think it shows what's possible when we can all also get together, not only for human means, but for commercial opportunity as well.
Ming, I think in terms, oh, sorry.
I just wanted to add one note. When he said that, you know, there was already a film about a Black president before we saw the president in the White House. I hope, Renee, you make another film with an Asian American as a president, so that we'll see that happen soon, or an Asian American woman as a president, please, because I would love to see that one day.
I hope it's not a fantasy. Excuse me. I think one thing about specifically the Black Lives Matter movement is, as allies, really taking leadership from that movement. I mean, you know, again, hearkening back to the Vincent Chin campaign for justice, it's the Rainbow Coalition and Jesse Jackson and other communities of color really came to support Asian Americans, following the lead of the Asian American organizers. So I think that's really critical. And the other thing, and this has been the hardest, I think, for a lot of Asian Americans, is starting with your families. It's really starting with your families. And people are, I see William is laughing. You know, it's hard to have a rational discussion, because if you look at the data and look at the history and, you know, things like you know, as I said, housing opened up for Asian Americans during the 50s as this model minority myth was really starting to gain traction. It opened up, you know, before it opened up for African Americans. I mean, there have been, you know, 65 immigration reform. There's a lot of policies that have favored Asian Americans and, you know, given us a step up. I mean, so that's very rational, but a lot of these discussions are not rational at all. How to solve that, I don't know. But again,
and Dr. Nguyen is currently working as the Director of Development and Marketing for Institute of Civic Education in Vietnam. And in 2002, she was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve on the board of Vietnam Education Foundation, a national foundation established by US government to foster the relationship between United States and Vietnam through education. And she's also Executive Director of Lyceum, Life Skills and Professionals Development for Success.
I was a refugee, escaping Vietnam those years after the war. Freedom is not free. In Vietnam, we paid by risking our lives at sea. Out of 1 million who try, only 1/3 make it to America. I was the lucky one who arrived and make a new life here. Freedom is not free. I'm now a proud Vietnamese American. My motherland gave me birth and identity, but it is America who gave me freedom and opportunity to blossom and be the best I can be. Freedom is not free. As a citizen of this beautiful country, it is a privilege and an honor to volunteer, to serve, and to give. Freedom is not free. It is our responsibility to keep the flame of humanity. More than ever, this spirit of humanity needs to be honored as we and the whole world are entering the period of coping with COVID-19 global pandemic. More than ever, we need to honor these values of compassion, of kindness, of love, mutual collaboration so that we can develop innovative solutions and develop community resiliency in the upcoming months. I believe in America's deepest value of respect, human dignity, and justice for all. I believe that hardship comes with opportunities, and we will all come out together stronger, more resilient, and more grounded. Freedom is not free.
So thank you all, and I hope we can all, you know, go out, have these tough conversations, and really work to unite our community.